When I was a little girl, I grew up in rural Nebraska, and in the summertime, I would often go to my grandmother's house. Now, she wasn't the warm and fuzzy kind of grandma you're thinking of. She always had tasks for us to do: gather the eggs, clean out the chicken house, pick the green beans, and if you picked the green beans, you would have to stem the green beans. And I can distinctly remember one time she and I were sitting on the porch. And we were stemming green beans, and I was trying to explain to her how my chore at my own home was to gather the eggs. And we have these sitting hens that were big and fat, and they would sit in the nest all day long. And they would sit on those eggs. And as a little girl, you were expected to reach under there, get the eggs, and put them in the basket. But that sitting hen would constantly peck you. And I said, "Grandma, I just hate that job." My grandma said, "Now listen, little pullet." That's what she called me, little pullet. She said, "Little pullet, this is what you do. The next time your mom has pork and beans, you save the can. And you wash the can out and you take it out to the chicken house. And when you're ready to gather those eggs under that sitting hen, you put the can over that chicken's head and reach under there, and she'll peck inside the can, but she won't peck you." And I'll tell you, that worked like a charm, it did. And after a couple times, I even remembered to take the can off the chicken's head. But then she proceeded, my grandmother, to tell me a story of when she was a child. Now, my grandmother's family immigrated here from Holland. And they went to Nebraska, and for many years they lived in a dugout. And when my grandma was a young girl, her mother developed appendicitis. And there was no treatment at the time, and she perished. So my grandmother was raised by her father, which would be my great grandfather, and her brothers. And her job was always to do the chicken chores as well. Now, she would throw mash out to the chickens, and they would all come running. And in those times, she said, we just let the sitting hen sit on those eggs until they would hatch. And one spring, a whole mess of little chicks hatched. They come scuttling out the barn with their moms. And one of those little chicks was not all yellow. It was speckled. It had black, and it had a little white, and it had a little yellow. My grandma said it was a throwback from the Leghorn line. I didn't really understand any of that at the time, but it was her favorite little chick. And she made sure that that little chick got extra mash and extra oats, and she watched over that little chick. And that little chick grew and grew and grew feathers out, but they weren't white feathers like the Leghorns, but it was speckled feathers, brown and black and a few white. And my grandmother loved that chicken. And she said she named that chicken Little Pullet also. Well, it must be in chickens as it is in people, because when that chicken was a little different than the other chickens, they picked on it. And Grandma felt so bad that they would pick on that chicken. Why, if she fed them, she would always have to feed Little Pullet separately because they would crowd Little Pullet out. And when they went out to scratch in the pasture, they would chase after Little Pullet. So Little Pullet would go further and further into the pasture and scratch here and scratch there and let the rest of the flock do what they did. And Little Pullet would come in late at night, and she would get on the roost. And sometimes Grandma said they would knock her off the roost. Well, Little Pullet grew, and that summer it got very hot. And then the storm clouds started just boiling and boiling up. And all the chickens ran back into the chicken house. But Little Pullet was far out into the pasture, just a scratching and a pecking and a scratching and a pecking, and didn't seem to notice the storm coming. It was a tornado. It knocked down trees, and it took off part of the hogshed, Grandma said, and Little Pullet just hunkered down as close to the ground as she could. And when that high wind passed, little Pullet hardly had any feathers left except on her belly. Well, now she looked really odd. And summer turned to fall, and the feathers started to grow back in. And fall turned to winter, and little Pullet was mighty cold that winter. Now, Grandma would always have hot water she would take out to the chickens in the morning, and she would break the ice in their water, and then she would pour the hot water in, and it would last most of the day so the chickens would have plenty to drink. And she always made sure little Pullet got a good drink. But one morning it had been bitter, bitter cold the night before, and all the chickens hopped down and little Pullet stayed on the roost. And Grandma went over there, and she could see that now little Pullet's claws were frozen solid to the roost. Well, she called her big brother Garrett, and she said, "Garrett, little Pullet can't get off the roost. Can you help her?" Now, you can imagine what old Garrett looked like. He was a big, brawny farm boy with great big hands like a bear. And he come in, "Oh, what is the matter with that dumb chicken?" And he grabbed hold of little Pullet's leg and jerked it. And it snapped right at the joint where the yellow meets the white feathers. Well, in her case, the speckled feathers. And ripped her leg right off. Oh, Grandma said she cried and she cried and she carried little Pullet around. And they told Grandpa. Grandpa says, "Well, put her on the porch. It is too cold to be butchered chickens. We'll butcher when it warms up." So Grandma said she took one of Garrett's overalls and she wadded it up and made a little nest for little Pullet on the porch. And she gave her some mash and made sure she had a little water that night. And Grandma worried about little Pullet all night long. And in the morning, lo and behold, the big old yeller cat was on the porch. Oh, Grandma thought, this is a bad thing. But the old yeller cat was in them overalls with little Pullet, and they were keeping each other warm. They became the best of friends. Grandpa, he was watching that, Great-Grandpa, and thinking it was kind of humorous, and so he didn't butcher little Pullet right off. And in time, little Pullet was able to peck, 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 and hop a little bit on her one leg, and her other leg healed up some, but she was pretty immobile. Christmas came. Grandma said, "We got an orange, and we got some hard sucking candy, and she got some new mittens." And then Garrett came over with a brown package. It was wrapped in a string. And he smiled at her and he said, "Here, Hannah, I made you something." And she opened it up ever so carefully. And in it was a wooden stick about yay long and a leather harness above it. And then there were straps. She says, "I don't know what this is." And he says, "It's a peg leg for little Pullet." Great-Grandpa laughed, and they brought little Pullet in the house. And they put that prosthetic leg on that chicken. And lo and behold, that chicken stood on her good leg, and she'd tap that prosthetic leg almost like she was tap dancing. And before you know it, she was walking around the kitchen floor. Step clunk, step clunk, step clunk. Everybody had a joyous Christmas just because little Pullet could finally walk. Little Pullet spent the rest of the winter on the porch with the yeller cat and her peg leg. But when spring came, little Pullet would hop off the porch, and Grandma would always put her back on the porch at night. And that yeller cat would always stay pretty close, watching out for little Pullet, watching out for little Pullet. But one spring morning, the mother chickens were so jealous of little Pullet getting all this attention, they done flew over the fence into the yard. And they attacked little Pullet. And there was a lot of cackling and squawking and carrying on, and the cat finally broke it all up, but Grandma come running out, and there lay little Pullet. And you could tell that she was just despondent from this. and her peg leg had fallen off. So Grandma carefully reattached little Pullet's peg leg, but she could see that she just didn't have the spunk anymore. She wasn't scratching and pecking. It wasn't soon after that, but little Pullet disappeared. Grandma looked everywhere. She looked under the porch, and she would look in the bushes, and she looked in the wash house. She looked around the wash house. She couldn't find little Pullet anywhere. The yeller cat just hung its head and kept patrolling the yard. It was about 3 weeks later, Grandma said she saw little Pullet. Little Pullet came out of the barn. She'd been underneath the granary part of the barn, and behind her was trailing 6 little chicks. They were all speckled, they were, and every one of them had a peg leg. That's the story of little Pullet. My uncle owned a bowling alley in the small town that we lived close to growing up, and he would order all kinds of snacks, little candy bars and nibs. Do you remember nibs? And little bags of potato chips. And one time on the order, it said if you ordered this amount, if you check this box down here, you could get Mexican jumping beans. And my uncle said, Mexican jumping beans? Well, that would be fun. So he checked the box, and the order came in. And he thought it would just be a little card with a few Mexican jumping beans that he could sell. But it was a 5-gallon bucket of Mexican jumping beans. My uncle said, lo and behold, what will I do with 5 gallons? And then he had a thought. Easter was coming. So he got those plastic eggs, and he filled all those plastic eggs with Mexican jumping beans, and he taped them shut. And while we were in church, now my uncle didn't attend church too often, but while we were in church on Easter morning, he hid those eggs all over our farmyard. And we came home and we had our Easter dinner, and then he announced, oh, I think it's time to go Easter egg hunting. And we did not know. But out we ran into the sunshine of the beautiful spring day, and there were eggs all over the yard. But those Mexican jumping beans had warmed up enough that they were making those eggs hop and hop and hop, and we were chasing those eggs. It was the most fun Easter I have ever had. Of course, after they cooled down a bit, we took the tape off those eggs and we poured them all back in the bucket. And he said, girls, those are yours. You can have them. And we played with those Mexican jumping beans. We would put them on the counter at school in the cafeteria. And when the cafeteria got heated up, pretty soon those beans would be jumping, and you could hear the cooks all the way down the hall screaming and hollering because they were frightened by those Mexican jumping beans. And we tried it on the teachers. Pretty soon we tried it on everybody, and they said, oh, those are just your Mexican jumping beans. We said, yeah. We had so much fun with them, we thought, I'll betcha we could sell Mexican jumping beans at the fair, at the county fair. It was always in August. So we went to the Farm Bureau guy and we asked him, how long does it take to grow Mexican jumping beans? He says, oh, never did grow Mexican jumping beans, but your ma's beans in the garden take about 54 days, and your pa's soybeans take about 90 days. So I would say 70 days. So we figured it all up, and we had to really get the crop in fast. We had to get a jump on it. So we asked our pa if we could plant these, and he said, well, there's that old weedy, grassy spot right across the road next to the little path that goes back into the field. You girls work that up, you can have it. We took the Ford tractor and we disked this way and we disked that way, and then we kind of took the harrow and knocked up the clods, and then we took the spring tooth and made little rows. We worked all day prepping the soil, we did. Then we took chicken manure and poured it all over it, thinking they would grow even better. And then we started putting our beans in the little furrows. But the sun was shining and the beans were popping out faster than we could get them covered. So then we had to resort to one of us crawling on the ground, putting the beans in, and the other one raking the dirt over so the beans wouldn't hop out. We worked all day planting 5 gallons of Mexican jumping beans. But the Lord blessed us that night, and it rained real hard, and it crusted over, so those Mexican jumping beans didn't have any chance of popping out. And it was about 7, 8, 10 days later, them beans done sprouted right through that crust, and they come up, and we had a beautiful crop. My father said he'd never seen a better crop of Mexican jumping beans. Of course, my father had never seen a crop of Mexican jumping beans before. And those plants started to grow and get leaves on them, and the sun shone on them, and the rains came, and they grew into plants probably as high as a knee on a kid by mid-May. And by mid-June, they were full plants, and they were starting to bloom. Now, I doubt if you know this about Mexican jumping beans, but their blooms attract lightning bugs. And at first, we'd just have a few lightning bugs here and a few lightning bugs there. But by the end of June, the sky at night was filled with these lightning bugs coming in, lighting up, landing, and taking off. By the 4th of July, people were lined along the road to see it because they said the lightning bug show was better than the fireworks. And you know, something else was attracted to those lightning bugs, and that was our chickens. We'd been raising chickens, and we'd sell eggs to the neighbors. And we didn't make a lot of money, but it was a little income for us girls. And we figured if we got a good crop of Mexican jumping beans, we could sell a bunch of them at the fair, and we'd counted it out. We figured if each plant made 4 pods and each pod had 6 beans, we would have enough for 5 bushel. We figured we could sell 3 bushels at the fair. We'd have 2 bushels to grind up, and then we would have chicken feed for maybe 2 or 3 months if we mixed it up with some oats. We were always figuring. So we saw our chickens, and they started to cross across the road to get those lightning bugs, those fireflies. And they would land in the daytime and hide in the beans, and those chickens would go over and peck, 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 peck. And then they would come back at night and go to roost. But we started noticing when we locked them up at night so the varmints didn't get them, that as they sat on the roost and it got dark, those chickens started to glow in the dark. For those firebugs, those fireflies, had started lighting up their insides. We told a few neighbors, and they came over and looked. It was an amazing thing. And before you know it, it spread like wildfire, and people were coming to see these chickens that were glowing in the dark on the roost at night. We started charging 50 cents for people to come and see them. The cars were lined up almost a half a mile long when the sheriff showed up. He said, "You're obstructing traffic. You're going to have to figure out something else." Well, we weren't going to lose out on this good profit because we were making more money having the show than we were selling the eggs. So we done took those chickens and we duct taped them to the fence posts around the pasture. And there was a little path around that pasture that you could drive through and then drive right back out a different way. So we just had a drive-through show. We charged $1.50 a car. It was pretty amazing. And by mid-July, or the end of July, it seemed that those chickens had eaten most of those bugs, and those chickens also weren't glowing so much, so we didn't have so much, so we'd really gotten it at the prime, you see. The road commissioner came by, and he said, "Those chickens are still crossing the road a lot." And so he put up a chicken crossing sign. It used to be a cattle crossing sign, but he put some feathers on the back end of it, and he put a little comb on the top end of it. It still had 4 legs, but it served the purpose, we thought. Well, by July, it got really hot, and the rains quit. We thought, oh boy, this is going to be bad for our beans. But they seemed to just thrive because, well, they were from Mexico, so they just started putting on pods and pods and pods, and those pods started to get dry. And you could hear this crackling and crunching out there. And lo and behold, those Mexican jumping bean pods were starting to break open. If it got really hot, those beans would pop out of it. And it wasn't just us here, and it was those chickens. Those chickens would go across the road, and they would chase those Mexican jumping beans all over our Mexican jumping bean patch, trying to catch them. And they would catch them, and they would gobble them down. And then they all of a sudden had to lay an egg. So they would put their legs together and trot across the road as fast as they could. They'd lay their egg, they'd cackle, they'd cluck, and they'd run back. And they'd eat some more Mexican jumping beans. It must have been really high protein for those chickens. Now, we'd gotten a lot of press, you see, from the Beatrice Star, which was a local paper, about our glow-in-the-dark chickens and our Mexican jumping beans. And well, people were starting to buy our eggs, and people came from all over to buy our eggs, and we were selling eggs and selling eggs. And then the complaints started to come in. Women were saying that they would crack an egg into the frying pan in the morning, and before it would ever get even solid at all, it would jump out of the frying pan. Women were complaining that they'd hard-boil their eggs for potato salad or deviled eggs. They could never get it hard-boiled. It would just jump out as soon as it got hot. It must have been the residual of that Mexican jumping beans in them eggs. They wanted their money back. We weren't too happy about that. But the worst was yet to come. For you see, the very worst was the United States Department of Agriculture had read the article in the Beatrice Star, and they had come out to investigate what we were doing. They came to the door and they knocked and they said, "Are you raising Mexican jumping beans here?" And we were excited. "Sure we are, yeah. We'd like to see them." So we took them across the road and we showed them the patch, which was full of chickens that were addicted to Mexican jumping beans, and they were just hopping all over. There was jumping beans jumping out of the pods, and there was some deposits left by the chickens as well out there. It was a hot day, I remember it, and one chicken jumped on top of one of those agents and knocked him down. He was upset. And then they just shook their head. They had a little conference, and they started writing us tickets for raising foreign produce, for using a public road for chicken crossing without a permit. Well, by the time they got done writing us tickets, we didn't have any egg money left. And then they said, "Destroy the crop." Well, by the time they got done out there stomping around and the chickens had taken care of it, we didn't have too much of a crop to destroy. So we never did get those Mexican jumping beans to sell at the fair. But you know what? My mama always said, you learn something from every experience. And this is what we learned. Number one, do not count your beans before they're hatched. Number two, when you got a good thing going, the government will screw it up. And number three, now we know why the chickens cross the road. When I was about 10 years old, it was August, back in Nebraska. One afternoon, a brown dog showed up. And this brown dog's tail would wag and wag and wag, and it'd bark and it would lick you. We didn't have a dog on the farm right at that time, and so we thought we'll just adopt this dog. It was brown except it had a star on its chest and a white tip on its tail, and we called it Tippy. Now Tippy was a fairly smart dog because my sister and I would hang out laundry and we'd put it in a red wagon and we'd pull it along as we went down the line, and pretty soon Tippy would grab hold of the handle of that wagon and he would pull it. We'd go, pull Tippy, and Tippy would pull it down a little ways. Pull Tippy, he'd pull it down a little ways. That Tippy was a good dog. Afternoon would come, we'd say, Tippy, go get the cows. Off Tippy would run to the pasture, and you could hear him bark. Ruff, 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 ruff. And then he would come running back. Them cows, chasing them cows, they'd kick at him. Tippy was never afraid. He'd just kind of nip at their heels. They'd come in, their bags would be a swagging, and Tippy'd be a barking, and those cows would go right in their stanchions where they belonged. Tippy would just sit down behind them and pant with his tail wagging. That Tippy was a good dog. Sometimes he would even help us with the hay. He would pull the hay bale over towards the elevator, and then we could put it on the elevator so it could go up in the barn. That was kind of hard work for Tippy, but he was a good dog, and we loved that Tippy. Now, winter came, and my dad had some stock cows out in the fields, and there was a pond down there in this one slough, and every morning my dad would walk down there and break the ice with an old axe so the cows could come down and get water for the day. Tippy would always go along. It had been fairly warm, and the water hadn't frozen very hard, and then it had snowed overnight. And that morning my dad went down there and he had to walk out on the ice a little bit, and when he did so, my poor dad broke through the ice, and the ice just kept breaking on him. And there he was, a good half mile from home, and all that was out there were the cattle and Tippy. And he yelled at Tippy, Tippy, get help! Tippy, get help! Tippy just ran in circles at first, and then he ran over to a little grove of trees, and Tippy would jump and jump and jump until he got a hold of a limb, and Tippy hung on to that limb, a kicking and a carrying on and wiggling, and that limb finally broke, and he drug that limb out onto that ice. My dad got a hold of that limb, and Tippy started pulling, and my dad said, pull hard, Tippy, pull hard. And my dad was able to slide across the ice, Tippy pulling him. They came home wet and cold, but Tippy was a hero. That Tippy was a good dog. Now Tippy loved to ride in the back of the old Studebaker truck. I don't know if you remember them old Studebaker trucks. I think they were always gray. And it had a 3 on the tree, they called it. No seat belts in those days. And my mom was driving the old Studebaker. We were going to go to town to get some chicken feed. And Tippy was in the back in the box, and my sister was all by the window, and I was in the center. And we were bouncing down this old Washburn road, and here comes a big old grain truck right over the rise. And he didn't even honk or nothing. And my mom had to take to the ditch. The guy didn't even stop. All we saw was this billow of dirt and dust from that gravel road. And we bounced and bounced and bounced and bounced down into this ravine, good 20 feet down there. But we never upset. When it finally stopped, we looked back and no Tippy. Tippy had bounced out of the box. Oh no, we thought. And then we heard it. Tippy was up there on that road barking at that truck. He was so mad. And I think if you could go there even today in that gravel road, you could see the footprints of Tippy. He was so angry he dug his feet into that road. Well, what were we to do? But old Matthias, John Matthias, come down the road in his Farmall tractor, and he couldn't hardly hear. He was just a putzing along, and Tippy ran out onto the road and then would run back into the ditch. Run out into the road and run back into the ditch, just like the Lassie shows. But old Matthias, he had never seen Lassie, and so John, he says, "What's the matter with you, Tippy?" And then finally he saw the tracks going down into the ravine. He says, "Oh no." He crawled off the tractor as best he could. He had arthritis, terrible. And he hollered down there, and I'll never forget it, because it was the first time anyone had ever called me this. He said, "You women okay down there?" My ma hollered back, "Yeah, we're good, but we got to get this truck out of here." John Matthias says, "No problem. I got all this log chains on here. I was going to go pull an old stump out. I'll just bring them down." And so he kept hooking them log chains together, and he got them all the way down to the truck, and he reached underneath it. This was when trucks were still good, that they had metal on them, and the fender didn't pull off when you tie something to it. And he tied it underneath there, and then he started back up that ravine to hook it onto the tractor, when all of a sudden that log chain just went taunt, and that truck gave a jerk. And then, lo and behold, we looked up, and there was Tippy with that log chain in its mouth. And I am not going to lie to you people, we had to push. But Tippy pulled that truck out of that ravine with that log chain. That is a good dog. Wasn't too many months later, well, it was August, that we were heading back to town again to get chicken feed, and Tippy's in the back end, and we get into town, and we backed up to the dock there, and the man is throwing the bags out, and Tippy would take and grab a corner of the bag and pull it to the front. Grab a corner of the next bag, pull it to the front, and then he would set that bag on top of the first bag. Because Tippy liked to stack those up so when on the ride home, he could be above the cab and his ears would get all that wind and his tongue would flap. Now, while he is stacking it, along comes a big old cattle truck. This was before all these rules came up, and there was a bunch of migrant workers riding on benches on the sides of the truck, and they were going up north to pull sugar beets in Nebraska, and this one stood up, and he saw Tippy, and he went, "Bueno Piero," which means, in Spanish, good dog. We didn't know that, but Tippy understood Spanish. Tippy's ears perked right up, and he looked at that truck, and I can still see it today in slow motion. He jumped out of the back of our truck, and he ran as fast as he could, and he jumped into the arms of that migrant worker, and he licked him all over, and he wagged his tail. And the truck went on down the road with Tippy. And we went back home. And my sister and I were sitting around the Formica table. And we were crying. My dad come in, and he said, "What are you crying about?" And we told him the whole story about Tippy going off with the migrant workers. My dad just shook his head, and he says, "Well, now that just goes to show you what you get for adopting a Chihuahua." One summer, the Home Extension Agency put out a little memo, and they announced that they were going to pay $50 for individuals who would enter a talent show. And each township could have their own talent show, and the winner would receive $50. Well, Lord knows we had plenty of kids out there in the country, but we didn't have the kind of talent you're thinking of, like dancing or playing the piano or singing pretty. But we had talent. So it was decided that we were going to put on a talent show over at the Pleasant Hill School. It was one of those one-room schoolhouses that wasn't holding school anymore, but the country folk kept it up. And people would play cards there, and there was a quilting group that would meet there, and the 4-H group met there, and it had electricity. It had a little kitchen, and it had a one-holer outhouse. It had a well, too, which was a good thing when our well would go dry, but I digress. So the night came when we were to have this talent show. And there was a wide porch on the front with a single door that went into it, and we thought this wide porch would make the perfect stage for a summer talent show. People brought their folding chairs, and some even had those nice aluminum web chairs, and they'd sit out there. And the first up was the Hilton family. Now, the Hiltons had 10 kids, and 80% of those kids were cross-eyed. That was their best attribute, really. I'm sorry to say that if they had had any brains, it didn't show much. But their talent that night was the 4 big boys got down in an awkward position, just kind of rolling around, and they got down to a kneeling position on the stage. And then 3 girls came in, and they crawled on top of those 4 boys, and they were building a pyramid. And there they were, all looking at the audience with their cross eyes, and nobody was sure who they were looking at. Then 2 more kids crawled on top, and then little Margaret. She was about 3.5, 4 years old, just a little bitty thing, and she climbed up there, and she went, ta-da! And that was their talent. Well, people hadn't seen this too often because most families didn't have 10 kids to build a pyramid like this, and they started applauding. And them dumb boys at the bottom started going like this because they wanted more applause, which made them throw themselves off balance, and the whole pyramid just collapsed into the lawn and nearly hit the county extension agent who was sitting there taking notes. Next up came the Fullerton brothers. The Fullerton brothers really had bad, crooked teeth, and they had a lot of acne. They weren't really much to look at, but they were hard workers, I'll give them that. And they brought up a dishpan full of watermelon and a bucket. Then they started to eat the watermelon. We were not impressed with watermelon eating for a talent. But after a while, they got enough seeds in their mouth, they started spitting seeds. And they were looking straight at you, but the bucket was over here, and they were able to spit them seeds right into that bucket, their teeth being so crooked. That was amazing. Next up came Cheryl Beets. Cheryl Beets had a little dog about yay big, and she had that dog. She had some chicken livers, and she would hold them up, and that dog would dance all around the stage. She had on a little doll dress on that dog, and it was so cute. She'd have that dog dancing, and then she would say, lay down, and that dog would lay down. And sometimes the dog would roll over when she told her to roll over, and it would sit, and it would play dead. And the last thing she said to that dog was, laugh. Now, we all thought that's odd, but instead of that dog barking like, "Arf, arf, arf," it went, tee-hee, 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 tee-hee. And as the audience listened, they started laughing, and the more they laughed, the more the dog would, tee-hee, 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 tee-hee. That's why she named that dog Chuckles. Well, we truly enjoyed that dog. The next family up were the Diddle family. Now, the Diddles, they had 2 daughters. One was my age, and her name was Kathy, but we called her Kat. And she had a little sister named Adisha. I think they meant to write Alicia on the birth certificate, but they didn't have a very good typist at the time, and she'd wrote Adisha instead of Alicia, and so it kind of stuck. I thought it was a very odd name. And the poor girl was so timid. Why, she would cry if you even looked at her wrong. I can't tell you how many times I got in trouble at school when I'd look over at Adisha and she'd start crying, and the teacher would say, "What'd you do now?" I said, "I just looked at her." "Well, don't be looking at her." Well, anyway, Adisha and Kat, they wanted to put on a little show. Their dad's name was Hyde, but everybody called him High, and their mom's name was Cindy. They didn't have a lot of money, and Kat always wanted to play a fiddle. They didn't have no money for a fiddle, so she started playing a saw. And she'd hold that saw on her knee, and she held the other end, and she had a kind of a narrow stick, and she'd go like this, and it would sing, that saw would. And Adisha had 2 wooden spoons, and she would play those spoons, clackety-clack, clackety-clack, clackety-clack. And they sang a old song that we sing in Nebraska sometimes called "The Windmill Needs Oil." I don't know if you've heard it. I'm not a very good singer, but, well, neither was Kat, and neither was Adisha. And it went a little like this. "The windmill needs oil, it's driving me insane. The windmill needs oil, please fill it to the vein." So it went. The saw made kind of an odd sound, and the clanking of the spoons, and the poor agent was trying to write something down, and, well, that's how it went. And then came Jan Singleton. Jan Singleton was a farm boy, and his folks had cattle, and every afternoon he would milk these cows. But he got one cow that he named Jumper, and he had taught that cow how to jump over. If you stacked 3 hay bales in a pyramid like, then he could get that cow to jump over that hay bale. And so he was going to be up next. But I have to tell you, he was holding on to that cow as tight as he could so that he could be up next and win the $50 when Kat was singing, "Windmill needs oil," and the singing saw was going, "Eeow, eeow," and that dog started going, "Teh, teh, teh, teh," and the cow thought that the dog was barking at it, and it broke loose on its halter, and the cow took off running, ran right through the audience towards the grader ditch, and everybody turned and looked, and lo and behold, there was little Margaret Hilton. The bathroom or the outhouse had been occupied, and she needed to pee, so she was there with her bottom exposed, and the cow was going to run right over her, and Jan hollered, "Jump, Jumper, jump!" And that cow jumped right over that little girl. Everybody went, "Oh," and that dog kept going, "Tee-hee, tee-hee, tee-hee, tee-hee," and everybody was so relieved, and then they all started laughing, and Adisha thought that they were laughing at her, so she ran off the stage with her spoons down to her mama, and she started crying. And that's when the county extension agent just got up and folded up his aluminum chair and went over and put it in the trunk of his car and drove off. None of us won the $50. Well, the folks sat around and talked a bit because it was nice just to visit and get out. And it was quite an event, we thought. The next day in the Arbor State paper, there was a little report by the county extension agent. He talked about all these talent shows that he'd been to, and then he said, "Pleasant Hill Talent Show." And this is what he said. "Hi diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle, the cow jumped over the moon, the little dog laughed to see such a sport, and Adisha ran away with the spoons."